He held the vial with hands that trembled not from cold, but from the way his whole life narrowed into a single flicker of light under the microscope. A strand of hair, coarse and dark, threaded with cells that did not answer the taxonomy of modern life. When the sequencer's screen had finally stopped scrolling, the sequence had been a refusal. Half-human patterns folding into something older, something braided with codons that hummed with a syntax Elias had no name for. He whispered a laugh that felt like both a prayer and a confession. "Of all the ghosts I chased," he said to the empty lab, "you were the one who refused to stay dead." Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. He had expected someone to burst through the door with congratulations. He had not expected Ana Maria Ionescu to be standing in the mist outside the greenhouse window, her silhouette tall and still as a birch, watching the halo of his lab lamp with the patience of a thing that had learned the art of waiting down to a ritual. She had come as if the forest itself had opened a door in the fog and sent her through. She came with the same wariness Elias felt when he reached for an instrument that might remind him of the project that exploded and left a crater where his faith once lived. "You can't do this here," she said without preamble, voice dry and low, as if speaking would exhale the forest's breath into his glass and spoil whatever fragile order he'd managed to coax from chaos. Her Romanian was garnished with old vowels, the vowels of villagers who spoke to trees, not data. You can't take their blood and make it something for you. He almost laughed, because most people who accused him of making monsters out of myths were so small with anger, a narrow, conditioned outrage that had nothing to do with the scale of what he held. Ana Maria's anger was wide and lived. It reached back more than 100 winters. He saw then, in the animal stillness of her, the weight of an entire lineage. The way she stood at the edge of his light made the lab look like a question posed in the wrong language. "You don't know what this is," he said, surprised that his voice did not betray the tremor in his hands. He set the vial down on the counter like a challenge. "I know what science can do. If this is real, it rewrites a map." "Maps are for people who want to claim," she said. "We do not need your map. We need them to live." Her eyes, when she stepped in closer, were not accusatory so much as cataloging. She was judging him by usefulness and threat. "What will you do when men in suits find the lines you traced? When papers and men with money come, asking to hold a piece of what keeps our hills green?" He did not answer. He felt suddenly childlike, ashamed in the presence of someone for whom loyalty was a sacrament and not a career path. "My work saved lives," he said. Habit, old and ingrained, offered defense. "I was with NASA. There are protocols. There are ethics committees." "Ethics," she echoed, and there was such a brittle tenderness in her mockery that it cracked him. She had seen ethics convened before. Men in heated rooms, decisions made with pens heavier than conscience. "Elias Reed," she said then, as if testing the syllables in her mouth like a spell. "The man who spoke at conferences and told people the universe was beautiful because it obeys equations. What do the equations say about stealing the breath of the forest?" The name fell from a world he had tried to leave. The part of him that liked fame and the small electric warmth of recognition recoiled. The other part, the part that had spent nights at a console and mornings in a lab smelling of ozone and coffee, leaned forward. "I retired," he said, "or I thought I did. Look, I came here to hide. I gathered samples after the reports, the rumors. The villagers said there were tracks, hair. I didn't come as a conqueror. I came because this is a scientific miracle." "Miracles are for churches," Ana Maria said, and for a moment her voice was softer, as if speaking of a child. We have no churches with that name for these things. We have names. Omul Paduri Pushchen. We have stories that keep teeth from the wolves and say when to plant the corn. If your miracle walks like a man and a thing older than time, it will be hunted. Elias remembered the last time he had been hunted, the explosion that took his team, the public scandal that suggested negligence where there had been 1,000 tiny failings and a single spark. He remembered the silence after. No calls, no invitations, only the hum of equipment and the occasional, terrible freedom. He had fled to the old growth because numbers did not lie, and the forest was patient. The forest did not demand press releases. It only asked, in a dialect older than law, to be left alone. "What do you want from me?" he asked. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked the lab with a careful, cataloging motion, hands behind her back like someone who keeps a ledger of debts. A woman used to tallying what the forest had given and what it expected in return. "I want you to stop," she said finally. "I want you to bury those sequences in the ground and never let another soul read them. I want you to prove to me that your heart is not loud with fame." He could have laughed then, the way the world often laughed at small-town superstitions. Instead, he felt a feeling unfamiliar to him, the sensation of being seen by an authority that had nothing to do with an institution, a verdict issued by the land itself and carried in a woman's bones. "You want secrecy," he said slowly, "but if this is what I think it is, it could help." Help whom? She cut him off with a look that burned through the thin rhetoric of aid. Help corporations, help armies, help men who think the world is a ledger. You know what they will call it? A resource, something to be patented. Or they will call it a weapon. Her voice dropped to a whisper so sharp it might have been the edge of a knife. And who will they ask to keep it safe? Not us. Outside, the forest breathed, a low gust through older trees that seemed to protest the sound of human voices in the room. Elias felt the room tilt. The side with his equipment seemed suddenly cold and small. He thought of the sequences, the odd codons that looked like fossils embedded in new bone, the mutations that would make grant committees cry tears of joy and make men with darker intents salivate. He also thought of the men he had once admired, faces lit by projectors, hands that had signed orders. The memory was a thin paper cut that never healed. "What if I can protect them?" he said, surprising himself with the conviction that rose from somewhere other than scientific curiosity, an almost primitive urge to shelter what is vulnerable. "I can sequence it more. I can create data that makes it legally defensible. I can—" "You think law will stop them?" she asked, and the amusement in her question was like someone watching a man build a dam against the sea. "The law follows the loudest money. Our law is the old law. My family keeps the covenant. We have sworn for generations to keep the omul. That is worth more than ink on a paper." There it was, the deep secret that made her both fierce and terribly human. Elias saw not merely a woman defending a myth, but a girl who had learned an entire philosophy from mothers and fathers who traded in stories as currency. He realized, with a painful clarity, how small his laboratory seemed compared to the centuries she carried like a quiver across her back. Still, his training argued in the only language he trusted. If the genome evidenced a link, then it could be used to protect, to argue for rights, to force institutions to reckon. His heart answered in a different tongue. If exposing it meant the death of the covenant, what would that make of the truth? They stood in that space between argument and alliance, two different kinds of guardians who had never met before, but whose territories overlapped in the same fragile place, the margin between human ambition and the wild's unquantified intelligence. A hawk cried beyond the glass, and the lab's heater clicked, as if trying to inject civilization's breath into the forest's patient pulse. "Who brought you the sample?" Anna Maria asked, sudden and sharp. Longitude and latitude of a betrayal mattered more to a guardian than theorems. Who touched them first? Elias hesitated. "I don't know," he said, which was both true and not. The sample had come from under a rock where villagers collected mushrooms. A friend in a nearby hamlet had sent him a parcel with instructions and a note. "It moves like a man, but older. We fear for children." He had cataloged it, anonymized it. He had done what scientists do when they want to be pure, turned the human into data. Anna Maria's face changed then. The lines around her mouth pulled tight. "If you came alone," she said slowly, "maybe you can be reasoned with. If you came with men who will pay, then the forest will not be so patient." He wanted to tell her that he had come alone, that his pockets were near empty and his passport expired, that the last thing on his mind was money. He wanted to tell her everything, but the habit of guardedness, the sterile compartmentalization that had saved him his sanity in the blast's aftermath, kept his lips shut. To tell the whole truth would be to open the door to questions about who he had been and who he still pretended to be. He found he could not yet trust his own bravery. "Walk with me," she said finally, after a silence that gathered like weather. "Come to the ridge. There is a place the elders sit when they decide. Let them see you. Let them hear you tell the story, and maybe they will accept you. Maybe they will let the Amo live." Elias wanted to refuse, to bury the sequences further, to lock the hard drives and pretend he had never looked at the hair under the microscope. But the scientist in him had another hunger now, a hunger for redemption that tasted like the possibility of doing something right for once. To be judged by the people he had not known existed seemed, perversely, like an honest form of peer review. He nodded. They walked out into the mist together. The air closed around them like a soft curtain, damp with fern scent, and the kind of silence that knew the shape of footsteps. Anna Maria moved like she had been born to the slopes. Elias moved like a man who had spent too many years inside climate-controlled rooms. Their conversation thinned into the sound of their feet and their breathing, the awkward intimacy of two strangers learning the geography of each other by the way they climbed the hill. At the ridge, a ring of elders waited under a circle of hawthorns and stones older than the fences that tried to bend the land into plots. Their faces were lines of weather and constancy, their eyes the gatekeepers of stories. When Elias stepped into their ring, he felt something ancient like gravity shift. They asked him questions the way a surgeon asks about a patient's history, precise, attentive, not unkind. When he told them where he had been and what he had sequenced, a woman with silver hair and hands like plucked roots reached forward and touched his sleeve as if measuring temperature. "They are children of the covenant," she said, voice thin as paper but cutting. "We have known since your grandfathers were small that the forest takes and gives. It braided itself with some blood to guard itself. We protect them, we hide them, we do not trade them for fire." Elias could feel the room narrowing around his chest. Here were people who had spent lifetimes protecting something he had reduced to nucleotide strings. He wanted to show them his graphs, his charts, his algorithms that rendered the monstrous into manageable patterns. But something in the way these elders moved, their careful, patient dignity, reversed the motion in him. He put his hands in his pockets, wanting to be less like a threat and more like someone who had stumbled into a house where his coming would be judged. "Then you must decide," Anna Maria said to him later, when the elders had conferred, and the answer was not a simple refusal, but a test. "They will give you conditions. They will tie you to this place. They will ask for your silence or your banishment." She looked at him with eyes that softened not into pity, but into an offer. If you want to stay, it will not be as a scientist alone. You will have to learn their laws. He thought of the sequences and the way the genome forked. He thought of his hands, steady with instruments, and his ability to make a world where things obeyed rules. He thought, too, of the silence after the explosion, the silence that had taught him how thin the world's promises could be. "And if I refuse?" he asked, because someone had to ask the question that would set the next storm into motion. "You walk away," she said, "and the rest of the world comes to the same conclusion you did in your lab, that what lives in the forest is fair game." The question hung, heavy and true, as fog pressed in. There was a quiet option here and a violent one. There was fame and money, or there was covenant and exile. Elias felt the calculus of a lifetime recalculate itself in a single, terrible instant. He had come to the forest to hide from equations that had turned into accusations. Now he found he must select between two principles: revelation as salvation, and revelation as endangering those who had trusted him without consent. He looked at Anna Maria then, standing in the half-light, a woman whose vow bound the past to the present in a way his scientific training had never taught him to account for. Her profile in the mist was a cliff he both feared and wanted to climb. He thought of the hair under the microscope, the old codons whispering of a world that had been braided with human blood, and realized that whatever he chose now would not only decide his life, but would tilt the axis of how the world understood itself. He exhaled. "I will stay," he told her, and in his voice was the tremor of someone stepping off a known edge into a story that had no protocols. He had meant the vow as a practical thing, a way to buy time, to slow the world. But when it left his mouth, the forest seemed to take him at his word. The elders did not cheer or sign papers. They watched with the austere curiosity of judges whose verdicts were rooted in weather patterns and birch sap. Their conditions were not legalese, but rights. Elias would live among them, learn their names for places and beings he had only ever put on maps. He would surrender certain tools, drones, long-range transmitters, any device that could betray hidden paths. He would submit his data to the council, not to journals. In exchange, they would permit the sequences to remain unread beyond the ring, contained in clay and binding wax, until the elders decide if the knowledge could be made safe. It was a settlement neither of a scientist nor of a believer, but a truce between a man who cataloged and a people who conserved by story. Elias wanted to argue, to sketch phylogenetic trees on the back of a grocery receipt, to show them the math that made the genome sing. Instead, he found himself learning a taxonomy of oaks and listening to an old man explain the sound a doe made when it was trying to tell you where the stream ran. He would later tell himself that these were compromises, necessary sacrifices for a higher scientific end. But in the evening heat of a peat fire, his compromises began to rearrange him. Anna Maria watched him with a careful, often thinly veiled skepticism that softened as weeks passed into an odd apprenticeship. Her skepticism was practical. He could be tempted. But she also watched him for other things: how he folded his hands when he listened, how he tended to small injuries with a nervous precision, how sometimes in the silence after a story finished, he would hum a tune that had no name. She began to map the parts of him that were salvageable: the way he burned his coffee so he would not forget it, the way he flinched at loud sounds, the way his fingers hesitated before touching a living thing, as if he feared they would hurt it. The first hurdle arrived like rain. A teenager from the next valley, A boy with a borrowed lorry and a head full of headlines returned to the village with a story of a foreign firm scouting roads. They had come under the pretense of forestry surveys, but left questions where they had left footprints. They asked my cousin, the boy said, throat dry with the adrenaline of someone who had always been too small for his own courage. They offered money for a sample. That night, Elias and Anna Maria walked the boundary where the village met the oldest stand of firs, the trees that whispered like a congregation. Anna Maria's jaw was tight. She had lived long enough to know what the scent of money did to people. It removed the forest's teeth. "Did you tell anyone about the sequences?" she asked. He thought of the sealed clay, the wax binding, the elder's ceremony, and said, truthfully, only the council. Her shoulders dropped a fraction. "Then we must move faster," she said. "We must speak in a language they do not speak." Their strategy was both simple and impossible. They would not publish. They would build a different defense, a living dossier of testimony, a lattice of human stories that would slow any legal machinery. Elias would use his credentials not to make the genome public, but to create a paper trail of expertise that argued for sanctuary. He would write white papers, not for journals, but for rights, phrased in the careful language of jurisprudence. Beings with intentionality, with lineage tied to human families, should be considered under protection statutes. His work would pivot from discovery to advocacy, from a desire to know to a hunger to keep. He was good at transformation. Science, at its best, is argument turned into service. He drafted documents with the same hands that had once typed grant proposals. He argued with clarity and cadence. He drew, instead of trees, networks of kinship. How human families in these valleys shared alleles with the Omalal line. How the genetic overlaps could be read as evidence of guardianship rather than ownership. The elders listened, sometimes baffled, sometimes proud. The younger villagers began to murmur, perhaps the outsider could help them make the world respect what they had suggested forever. But the humans in these valleys were poor, and desperation erodes vows. The first fracture arrived in the form of a cousin who had dug mushrooms with one hand and counted debts with the other. Money whispered that one could fix a leaking roof, or buy a winter's worth of grain. "They'll pay for a hair," he said to a neighbor, and then to another, and the sound of his voice spread like mold. Men with worn faces and good intentions became carriers of temptation. One by one, pockets fattened by small sums, someone offered a sample, a scrap of fur, a footprint taken in plaster, to a contact who promised an easy sale to a lab in a far capital. When Elias heard of this, the air in his chest turned to stone. He had tried, with every quiet action, to prevent this very thing. He had not counted how hunger would gnaw at those who had kept secrets for generations. He found first a trail, receipts, a message chain on a cracked phone, a name of a courier who had driven to the town and left with the kind of haste that smells of fear. The trail led, inevitably and horribly, to a man who had once been their shepherd and now worked nights in a plant. The shepherd's name was Mircea, and when Elias confronted him under a birch that had seen 3 harvests, Mircea's eyes filled with a complicated, stupid bravery. "They said they'd give us enough," Mircea said. His voice had the high tone of someone admitting to a sin by way of bargaining. "They said they'd keep it hidden. They said they would not let cameras in. We could have fixed the roof. We could have sent the kids away from work." Anna Maria's hands were fists. "You sold your kin," she said, and there was blood in her mouth when she spoke. It was not accusation alone. It was the pain of someone who had taught children not to trade what kept the night dark for coins. Mircea's answer was small. "I don't want the beasts to die. I need my children to live." Elias could not fix poverty with lines of code. He had learned that lesson in the worst possible way. He could, however, try to intimidate the buyers, to intercept the courier, to paint an ugly legal picture that made any transaction a liability. He called in favors like one calls in old debts. A colleague in a university legal clinic, a friend who owed him a courtesy favor in exchange for past kindnesses. They constructed a letter, not public, but severe, warning of prosecution for trafficking in protected species and hinting at international consequences. For the moment, it worked. The courier's contact went silent. The mail that might have been flung across borders stalled in bureaucratic teeth. But the damage had been done. Trust had frayed. In the evenings, villagers looked at Elias differently, some with grateful eyes, others with the suspicious glance reserved for someone who had come from a world of contracts. Rumors curled like smoke. The foreigner was a traitor. The outsider would bargain their lives for his career. Anna Maria heard these whispers in the night and returned to the ridge often, to argue with elders, to mend fences with broken vows. On one such night, she came to Elias when the moon hung thin and tired. He had been sitting by the peat fire, the sealed clay box in his lap like a small, heavy child. He was exhausted in a way that felt like a scab that would not come off. "They think you are a wolf with a human face," she said simply, sitting close enough that the heat of the embers pooled between them. He looked at her then as if seeing her newly, the loose braid that had come undone in the wind, the small scar along her knuckle where a branch had once snapped, the way her chest rose and fell in rhythm with fires and stories. There was a soft vulnerability under her guard, the kind that arrives when someone has been awake too long with their heart full of worry. "And what do you think?" he asked. "I think you are trying," she said, "and that you make mistakes." There was a tenderness now that surprised him. Not pity, not mere tolerance, but a real recognition of his efforts. The way she said it was like handing him a map when he had lost his sense of direction. "But we must do better. We must stop those who will buy." They planned raids of a different kind, not to capture the creatures, but to capture fear. They organized patrols at night to watch roads, to intercept strangers, to return small salvageable items to their owners before the buyers could take them away. Elias learned to set snares, not to harm, but to alert. Small jingle devices made from canned metal, borrowed from a canning business in the next valley. He learned to move soundlessly, his old muscles relearning a different kind of calculus. Anna Maria taught him the names of the trees and how to listen for the difference between a fox's curiosity and a human's aim. In the shallow hours before dawn, when the world felt like an unsent message, they found time to speak of other things that had nothing to do with genomes or contracts. Elias talked haltingly about the lab before the blast, about a bright kitchen light and a child's laughter he had never been allowed to hear. Anna Maria spoke of seasons in a voice that always softened when she described her mother grinding corn, of the way a child's first snowman was held by the whole community. There was a clumsy tenderness in the small intimacies of people who had not intended to fall in love, but found themselves building tenderness like a shelter against storms. Yet between these small mercies lay the hard iron of reality. The world beyond the valley rearranged itself into lines of interest and appetite. A biotech firm, alerted by smugglers who sniffed profit, filed an inquiry with a national agency. A man in a suit, sleek, polite, with a voice designed to open locks, contacted a government liaison with a dossier padded with grant potential and arm's-length philanthropic promises. The agency assigned a liaison who visited the elders under pretense of ecological study. Questions were asked about habitats, not genes. Still, every question was a tightrope walk toward exposure. Elias felt the pressure like a storm front pushing leaves flat. He knew the science would not hide itself forever. The longer he stayed silent, the more dangerous the silence became. The longer he fought privatization, the more he suspected the world would try to pry the forest open. He had chosen to stay, to learn, to build defenses made of both law and story. But every inch forward was paid for faith. The villagers' faith in him. Anna Maria's growing tenderness laid alongside distrust. His own shaky conviction that truth could be a protection rather than a wound. One night, as wind argued with the eaves, a child came to the elders' ring, breathless and shaking. "They saw them by the ridge," the child panted. The word faltered under the weight of shared history. The elders listened, then moved like predators who had been given a weakness in their usual prey. Careful, deliberate, protective. The council decided to move the most vulnerable creatures deeper into the forest, where paths were less known and the ground gave up secrets slowly. As they mobilized, Elias felt a cold certainty settle in his bones. The next fracture would not be a small one. The interests that had smelled potential were patient. If they could not buy a hare now, they would hire trackers, use satellites, exploit hunger. The fight ahead would not be a skirmish. It would be a war of attrition waged with money, law, and the hungry curiosity of a world that believed nothing should remain unknowable. He looked at Anna Maria, who had already taken up a mantle she had worn since childhood, and felt a fierce, almost stupid desire to shelter her with something more than words. He had come to the forest to hide. Now he realized he had come to find a place where his knowledge might be put to use as a shield rather than a scalpel. The mantle he offered back would not be power in the old sense, but partnership. He would learn the old laws, speak them in a modern tongue, and when the world knocked, he would be there to answer with more than data. He closed his hand over the clay package in his lap and felt its weight like a promise. There was fear between them, real and raw, but beneath it there was also a growing sense of alliance. Two kinds of guardians learning the contours of a shared enemy. They would need to bind the science to stories and the stories to law. They would need allies with more than hunger in their pockets. They would need to be clever, merciless in defense, and tender where things could be tendered, because it was not only the creatures at stake, but also the fragile human things that made the villagers keep their nights. Anna Maria's lips brushed his shoulder when she passed him a blanket that night, a small human thing that said more than any council meeting. He accepted it as a truce, perhaps, between two worlds that had not known how to speak until now. They did not know yet that the traitor's consequences would arrive sooner than anticipated. They did not know that a camera lens hung like a wasp in the trees would find a child's face. But in those small, necessary bargains, law reimagined as shelter, science as advocacy, love as cautious alliance, they began to stitch a defense. The stitches would fray, the needle would sometimes slip. But for the first time since the sequencer screen had stopped scrolling, Elias felt the tremor transform from fear into something like resolve. He would not be the man who made monsters of myths. He would be the man who learned how to protect them. They found the camera that week not by luck, but because a child with a bright, unspooling curiosity could not keep from telling more than she should. Little Anna, whose hair always smelled like chimney smoke and wild thyme, had run into a clearing and seen the lens shining like an insect. She had told a cousin. The cousin had told a neighbor. The neighbor, with hands that shook when he thought of winter, had shown a photograph to a man in a bar who said he knew a buyer. The buyer was hungry for proof. The firm needed proof. Proof is what the world trades in, and proof eats privacy. Elias went into the woods with Anna Maria and a small handful of watchers the night they took it down. The camera had been tethered to a branch with black tape and a patience the hunters did not have. It recorded in bursts, sent images when it could, stored light where it landed. When Elias pried open the casing, his fingers smelled of resin and machine oil and an old, inexplicable grief. Inside were images that made his chest hollow out, grainy frames of shapes that could be misread by someone who wanted them to be a product. There were pictures of a broad back disappearing into trees, and a close-up of knuckled hands pressing against moss. The last image, the one that had made the child's mouth spill, was a face half-turned to the camera. A face not quite the world expected, soft around the jaw, with an old, patient intelligence in its eyes that might have been human if the human had been braided with something older. "It will be proof for them," Anna Maria whispered, and for the first time her voice carried the edge of someone who had been betrayed by the inevitability of human smallness. "They will show this and make a market." They debated burning the card. The suggestion landed in the middle of the night like a burning brand. Destroy the evidence and risk suspicion. Keep it and risk a leak. Elias felt the old impulses of a scientist. Data should live. Data should be replicated, warring with the newfound reverence he owed these lives. He thought of the sealed clay, the elder's wax, the rites that asked for patience. He thought of Mirce's children and the roof that sagged. He thought of the world beyond the trees that believed nothing sacred. In the end, they copied the images onto a drive Elias encrypted with a technique Anna Maria would later laugh at, her laugh a sound like a stream finding stone. They buried the original card in a cairn beneath a young oak and placed a moss marker. The drive, however, slithered into the wrong hands within days. It wasn't the firm that got it. It was not, as they feared, a sleek man in a suit with a legal brief and a smile designed to pry. It was a woman with a camera and a stubborn conscience who bargained with a smuggler for proof, convinced she would expose the truth for the good of science. She came to the valley convinced she was an emissary of progress, and she left with that drive pressed under her arm, muttering about grants and front pages. She sent an encrypted message to a journalist in the capital, and the journalist, young, hungry, sold a story for a byline. The byline carried a photograph, and the photograph carried the child's face and the creature's look and the village's names. The next morning, the elders found a paper already printed in the capital's morning pages. The headline was clinical and damned. Primate-human hybrid. Outsider scientist discovers linked genome. The photograph they ran beneath the headline was of the ridge at dawn. Anna Maria in profile, the peat fire like a wound in the earth. Taken without permission in a moment intended as a blessing. The article named Elias, referenced NASA, and suggested both miracle and market. Silence in the ring broke like glass. Men who had walked the ridges for decades found themselves pacing, hands in the air, shouting for order that did not belong to them. Women wept, not because they had never imagined exposure, some had, like old premonitions, but because exposure felt real, smacking of foreign tongue and foreign law. Children were hushed. The market that had been suspected was now knocking and had a printed invitation. Elias read the article with the awkward, private horror of a man whose life had been co-opted by someone else's narrative. His instruments lay idle in the greenhouse like forlorn birds. When Anna Maria came, she did not speak for a long time. She sat on the peat like a woman listening to an animal that might be dying, fingers knotted around a cup that steamed and did not warm. "You promised silence," she said at last, and there was no accusation in the words so much as the shattering of a covenant. "You promised to keep the sequences in wax. Now they have been made a story." He had no ready explanation, because his denials would sound like the rehearsed evasion of a man who still had the reflex to protect a reputation. I didn't send anything. I kept it sealed. I moved as they asked. Someone else made your lack of word mean something," she finished. Her voice was not quite a knife, not yet, but it cut. There was a variation in the elders' faces. Some eyes hardened with the practical action they had always reserved for invaders. Others softened with a grief that aged them further. The village breathed in a near sigh, the air between them dense with the smoke of trust burning. Debate became fracture. Mircea was not the only one tempted by small offers. The story amplified that temptation. Offers turned to threats. Men who wanted change argued the morality of silence when their children were hungry. Others held to the old covenant with a kind of sanctity that would not be negotiated. Where before there had been whispers, there were now lines drawn. Elias, who had vowed to learn the elders' language and laws, saw the first rupture not as theory, but as a physical tear in a community's fabric. He tried to stitch by practical means. He offered funds he could neither truly supply nor be permitted to spend. He proposed relocation plans he did not have the authority to implement. Each gesture flagged his outsider status, too late to console, too early to solve. Then came the raid. Small, hurried men with government badges, but the appetite of private contractors. They said they came to assess ecological impact. They tarried with a legalese that smelled like rent. They had cameras, not the careful, clumsy kind Anna Maria had come to understand, but clean lenses that recorded everything with a fidelity that felt like accusation. They spoke to the elders softly, and then more insistently when the elders spoke in parables instead of legalese. Mercia's cousin, who had taken small payments to show a path, pointed them toward an area where footprints had been found. The men smiled when given path and proof. They smiled as a way of acknowledging a contract with success. The creatures fled deeper into pockets of the forest that had never been touched by plow or boot. But pictures were taken of empty clearings, and those pictures would be parsed later as evidence of habitation, as a map. The liaison from the agency, with his smile like a polished coin, left with a dossier full of images and a list of villagers who had been cooperative. Some of those villagers would be promised employment. Others would be told their names might be cleared if they helped further. The coin and the letter rearranged loyalties like pieces on a chessboard. Anna Maria watched the men go with the silent fury of someone whose people's memory was a living thing. She turned to Elias, chest heaving. "They set a blade to the belly of the valley," she said, voice low. "And you?" His words were small and insufficient, and everything he had feared, the language of a man who believed systems could fix human need. "No," she said, and it was not a denial of his effort so much as the final counting of trust. "You made a promise to our elders. You told us you'd be the hand that kept a secret. Secrets must be tended like a sick child. You left the window cracked." He had left the window cracked in ways he could not fully admit to himself. He had reached out, unwisely, to a journalist in a flush of wanting to be heard by peers, to feel useful, to stitch his frayed credibility. He had wanted advocacy. He had not foreseen that advocacy would travel like wildfire to men who haggled in currency and fear. The fracture that cut deepest was not between him and a nameless agency, it was between Elias and Anna Maria. Her eyes, usually steady as river stones, glittered with a hurt like frost on glass. "You should have known better," she said. "You are a man who loves being seen." There was no accusation in the way that followed, only a truth given like a verdict. "We do not." He tried to reach for her hand, and his fingers closed on a sleeve instead, the small physical misstep of someone who had not yet learned the new rules. "I am sorry," he said, and the apology felt like a fragile bridge built of apology alone. "Sorry is what they will print while they take everything else," Anna Maria said. Her voice was small now, the size of a wick. "We cannot be sorry if we are dead." The elders convened again, and this time their decision was less patient. They would move more than creatures, they would move people. Families would scatter to safe households deeper in the forest for a season. They would change names, shift paths, teach children how to walk without being seen. Elias offered to stay as part of the watch. Anna Maria said he could, if he earned the right. That right would not be given by posture or promises, by actions, by nights kept, by grain shared, by refusing every path that led to profit. He accepted because acceptance was the only currency he had left that might purchase trust. But the price was higher than he had imagined. The village's fracture widened. Those who chose safety with the agency's aid were estranged. Those who chose covenant lost goods and sometimes relatives. In the weeks that followed, the air between neighbors carried a brittle new sound, quiet accusations like paper tearing. At night, Elias dreamt of the sequencers, scrolling lights. No longer a parade of data, but a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat he had made public. He woke sometimes with his hands wet, convinced he'd betrayed a church whose sermons he had never attended. He learned to move lighter, to speak less of statistics and more of stories, because he knew now that the forest's survival would be argued on human terms as much as genetic ones. He knew, too, that he had fractured the very thing he had come to protect. Anna Maria, who had watched him with both compassion and a lawyer's accuracy, kept her distance. She taught others to set new trails. She taught Elias to patch nets and mend roofs with the blunt, necessary patience of a woman who must do both the heart's work and the community's labor. Their private conversations were careful now, every intimacy measured for how it might be used against them. Love, if it could be called that yet, grew in stolen increments, a handed piece of bread, a look that lasted a second longer. And beneath it all, a fiercer truth lay like a sleeping root. Exposure in print would not merely be a headline. It would be a summons. It would call scientists who loved fame, firms who loved profit, and governments who loved control. The world rarely left good things alone. The fracture in the village was the first outward sign of a pressure that would not relent. Elias held on to the elders' trust like a thread that might yet be knotted. He wrote briefs not for journals, but for courts and for sympathetic NGOs. He learned how to plead not for publication, but for sanctuary. He moved with the measured humility of a man who had been given a second chance, and who now understood that second chances often rigged the moral scale with weights he could not yet fully measure. He did not yet know how the world would escalate, only that it would. He did not know which betrayal would next come from hunger or hubris. He did not know if the love budding between him and Anna Maria would survive the next headline. What he did know, with the steady, terrible clarity that had come from weeks of shared hardship and mutual watchfulness, was that truth alone would not save what needed saving. Secrets could no longer be naive shelters. Protection would require strategy, sacrifice, and a willingness to hurt for the sake of others. The village moved. The creatures shifted. And in the thin dawn, Elias sat alone and mapped scenarios like a man who had once trusted only numbers. Only now the numbers included faces. Old women with braid-sore arms, children with chipped teeth, Anna Maria with a scar he had learned to read like a text. The fractures around them might mend with skill and time, or they might split wide into an abyss the valley could not cross. There was no longer any certainty he had once prized. There was only choice: to keep trying, to keep risking, to keep loving in a world that wanted everything explained and therefore owned. He could hear the engines before he saw the lights. A convoy of black trucks threaded the valley road like a colonizing tide, headlights cutting the fog into white knives. The village rose as one. Shutters slammed, dogs barked like alarm bells, and elders draped themselves in wool the way people put on armor. Anna Maria moved faster than panic. She moved with the kind of urgent grace learned from years of shepherding secrets. Elias followed, breathless and foreign to running through mud with a rifle not of war but of protection. A legal pad, a sealed affidavit, a camera he would not let the world see. "We must not take them alive," she said without looking back. Her voice had the brittle authority of someone who had watched pity lead to slaughter. "We must mislead their eyes." The men with badges were polite at first, the kind of politeness designed to smooth resistance into compliance. They spoke of impact studies, of conservation, of an interest in community science partnerships. One of them, a clean-faced man with a tape recorder and a soft smile, asked for names and GPS coordinates. When the elders answered in parable and refusal, he shifted tone. The smile thinned, and the recorder became an instrument of leverage. Elias stepped forward and did the only thing he could that might matter in a world that valued proof. He offered a legal counter. He presented the council's sealed affidavit, a document he had drafted in sleepless hours and bound in wax, explaining the covenant, the genetic ties, the possible violation of both national and international protections should the men press. He read into the record not data, but testimony. Mothers, hunters, children, elders, swearing that the forest had rights. He invoked obscure statutes, precedent cases, the language of personhood and sanctuary. The portal of diplomacy cracked. For a moment, the men with badges hesitated. Bureaucracy cares for its paperwork. One official excused himself and spoke into a phone. In those minutes of waiting, a child ran past, her hair a comet tail, and the convoy's attention shifted toward her like vultures toward a gleam. A camera lens caught her face. A man in the second truck smiled with the appetite of someone who had never been taught restraint. Anna Maria moved like a shadow and not a shadow at the same time. She slipped between the child and the truck, her body aclaim, her eyes fierce as any law. "You will not take our children," she said. She did not beg, she did not bargain, she declared. One of the officials stepped down, placard out, and offered to check the sealed clay Elias had brought, to satisfy their curiosity while promising discretion. It was a trap phrased like courtesy. Elias felt the old reflex, to open, to disclose, to validate his work, rise like a tide. He saw then what his vows had cost. A moment's temptation could turn into an invitation. He leaned forward, palms open and honest. "If you break that seal," he said quietly, "you break what I have sworn to this people." Silence widened. The official's hand moved toward the clay. Anna Maria's breath stopped the same way a hunter's does when prey flinches. The man hesitated. Behind him, a reporter's camera clicked like a metronome of doom. Then Mircea stepped out from the crowd. His eyes were raw but steady. "Leave them," he said to the officials, his voice carrying the wrongness of someone who had taken a price and now sought to unpay it with his life. "Take me instead." The convoy's eyes shifted to him, hungry and puzzled. Mircea's wife called his name, hands clutching at his sleeve, but he shook her off with the terrible politeness of a man accepting the shape of an atonement. "I sold a path. I will give myself so the others can keep theirs." Anna Maria moved like lightning. She grabbed Mircea's shoulders and smashed her forehead to his, a sacrament of shame and absolution. "No," she said fiercely. "You gave your coin, but you are not the price. You are ours." Elias realized then that the true sacrifice would be political, not only personal. He stepped between Mircea and the officials and did what his old life had once taught him to do. He made a calculation not to save face, but to save lives. He offered himself. "If you want proof, take me," he said, voice calm as the before-storm sea. "Take my data, my devices, my person. Name me as the public contact. I will stand trial. I will be their example. Leave them." The convoy manager's smile faltered. This was not the script he'd anticipated. Elias' offer was a currency governments understood. An insider, a scientist, a public face to exchange for the quiet safety of a people who had been unnamed. A hush fell. Ana Maria's hand found his, fingers clamping like a lifeline. The elders watched, eyes like weathered maps. And in that instant, Elias saw what redemption could demand. A willingness to be burned so others could remain in shadow. The officials deliberated as if by law, but the calculus had shifted. They could seize a scientist and the headlines would justify their hands. Or they could back down and risk the indignation of their funders. The manager exhaled, made a choice for the smaller disaster, and announced he would take Elias's devices and detain him for questioning, a soft kidnapping dressed as protocol. Ana Maria's face went pale, then hot. She pressed her forehead to Elias. "You do not have to," she whispered. He kissed her like confession, quick and fervent, a mouthful of apology and an oath. "I do," he said. "I have broken things to get here. I will fix them." When the men moved to lead him away, the village stood between them and the forest, hands linked, voices raised in song and complaint, a communal shield of ordinary people refusing to let their sanctity be negotiated away. Mircea wept openly, his bargain reversed, not by coin, but by witness. Ana Maria's voice cleaved through the roar, commanding the attention of men who had never learned to respect a woman's vow. Elias looked back once, at the ridge, at the ceiling stones, at the elders who had made him a ward. He saw also Ana Maria, strong, furious, utterly human, and felt the shape of what he would lose and what he would gain. He allowed himself to be led as if to a trial, certain that this sacrifice, public and heavy, might be the lever that saved more than genomes. It might save a covenant, a people, and the fragile, forbidden bloom of the love that had taken root between him and a guardian of stories. As the convoy rolled away, Ana Maria pressed the sealed clay into the elder's hands. "Keep the covenant," she said. "Keep it with teeth." Elias watched the valley shrink, and then he let himself close his eyes, not with fear, but with a steady, yielded resolve. He had chosen to be the lantern so others could remain the night. In that choice was the redemption he had sought, and the claim he now made. Love is not only gentle. Sometimes it must be the brave thing that bleeds for the sake of another's shelter. They released him 3 days later with paperwork that smelled like compromise. A signed agreement to launch a formal investigation into unauthorized fieldwork, and a tacit promise from the liaison that the valley would receive discretionary funds for infrastructure, if and only if the council cooperated with an official monitoring program. It was a thin, crooked victory. Elias walked back into the valley under an uneasy sun, his hands still smelling faintly of resin and the metal tang of interrogation rooms. The elders met him at the ridge, not with triumph, but with the quiet gravity of people who understood how fragile outcomes can be. Ana Maria did not run to him the instant he reappeared. She stood at the edge of the peat fire, wrapped in a wool cloak that had taken generations to make, and watched him as if cataloging the way suffering had reshaped his face. When she finally crossed the ring, it was not to bury anger. It was to test whether their fragile trust could be rebuilt with hands that now knew how to break. She stepped close and placed her palm over the old clay seal still warm from the elder's keeping. "You paid the price," she said, voice hushed, "but we will still pay the cost in vigilance." Together, they turned the breach into a new law of living. Elias used the notoriety that had once threatened to ruin them as a shield instead. He wrote op-eds under agreed pseudonyms, he guided international lawyers towards sanctuary frameworks, and he helped the elders craft legal language that married ancient covenant to modern statute. The village became, slowly and cautiously, an accredited sanctuary, protected land with a charter acknowledging the forest's sentient custodians and the human families bound to them. It was not complete safety, but it was a line drawn in the dirt that others would have to cross under the glare of legal consequence and public scrutiny. People who had sold small things to survive were forgiven in formal ceremonies that honored need and required restitution. Murcha reclaimed a place in the community by tending bridges and teaching his children to listen to birch songs. The elders tightened their protocols for outsiders, and the watchers learned to read the sky as well as they read the law. Elias taught mapping by night and knots by day. Anna Maria taught him how to feel a trail's intention rather than merely record its coordinates. Their love, tempered in risk and woven through shared duty, became less like romance in a laboratory and more like partnership on a ridge, steady, practical, fierce. Months later, in a small clearing ringed by hawthorn and stone, they held a naming for a young Omel whose lineage the elders acknowledged privately and legally as protected. The child's breath fogged in the morning air as the elders spoke an old covenant in a voice that tasted of peat and iron. Elias held Anna Maria's hand then, their fingers knotted like two roots finding purchase. He had brought charts and clauses and arguments. She had brought vows and a map of the human heart no chart could render. Together they watched the forest accept its child. As the mist lifted, a doe stepped into the clearing and bowed her head as if in blessing. The last image Elias carried forward was ordinary and relentless. Anna Maria standing at the edge of the trees, hair loose, hand extended into dim green space, and the world, by law and by story, choosing, for now, to keep something, secret and wild, alive.